Port Hope, where the future lies, or does it? And we have to realize that the future is really and truly in our hands, and it's up to us to make what future we wish for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. This is a picture, a photograph of Port Hope taken by Robert Del Tredici. Pretty little town, of course, and with the Cameco uranium refinery conversion factory in the back, which, as Faye has already mentioned, is going to be up for a license renewal this fall, and I'll be coming back at that time to talk about it. I think it's something that everybody should pay attention to because it's an ongoing activity, and they want to extend that license for another 20 years, I believe. So by all means, take an interest in that. So Port Hope apparently has great expectations, at least from the point of view of Ontario Power Generation. Ontario Power Generation, who claims ownership of the site where the old oil-fired plant was, has said that the Wesleyville site could house up to 10,000 megawatts of nuclear capacity. That would make it the largest nuclear plant in the world, as you all probably know, and it would almost double the entire nuclear fleet of Ontario Power Generation. The entire nuclear fleet in Ontario right now is just about at that level totally. And this one plant would more than double that. That means that you would have just as much radioactive emissions and radioactive waste being produced from this one plant as from all of the other reactors in the province. Here's an overhead picture taken by Robert again of the Bruce site, a portion of the Bruce site, because it's so large you can hardly take it in with one photograph. And just think of the town of Port Hope and the county around it, and whether this is really a suitable addition to that site. What it's going to mean for the county in terms of traffic, in terms of noise, in terms of pollution, in terms of demand for services, and so on and so on. It really is a truly life-changing experience, and it depends upon what your priorities are. I'm sure that when a project like this comes in, there are people who can make a lot of money out of it. Other people can suffer the consequences. The question is, what are your values and how much prepared you are to stick up for them? This is a picture, an industrial picture, which gives you a little bit more of a view because it takes in the 8 reactors, the Bruce A and the distance there, and the Bruce B closer up, and the old heavy water plant, which is shut down now. But that is only 53% of the Wesleyville project. This is only a little more than half of what the Wesleyville project would entail. So look at that picture and ask yourself, is that what you would love to see in your community? And they also have a requirement at Bruce for top security. And so they have a SWAT team, which has won U.S. national SWAT team competitions more than once because they're so tough. And they're allowed to use prohibited weapons, that is fully automatic machine gun type rifles that are forbidden to be used by the police or even by the RCMP. And that's because they are entitled to protect the plant with whatever force they deem necessary. And one of the reasons why they figure that this kind of protection is needed is because of the great hazard associated with the plant itself. Even though they like to say how safe it is, they need to have heavily armed guards to even try and keep making it safe as time goes on. A single CANDU fuel bundle, which is about the size of a fireplace log, would kill any human being in a matter of 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter. This fuel bundle is as lethal as those automatic weapons. It'll kill you in very short order. And we now have in Ontario 3.5 million, 3.5 million of these fuel bundles. And we don't know how to render them safe. We don't know how to do anything other than to move them to a location and hide them in such a way that they will never come back and hurt anybody. And that's the extent of the brilliant plan that we have for dealing with this waste. It's hiding it in a hole, digging a hole somewhere, putting it down there, and just saying a Hail Mary and walking away and saying, okay, Don't go anywhere, will you? You may not realize it, but that waste is going to be accumulating right here in your neighborhood because they're not going to take it anywhere soon. In fact, they have to store it for 10 years in a pool of circulating water. And all the time it's in that pool, the radioactivity is slowly dying down, but it's still extremely lethal for hundreds of years, even to approach. And the reason they have to cool it with water, this is another photograph by Robert Del Tredici, by the way, of the Darlington spent fuel bay prior to it being inaugurated, prior to its being used. You can just see how big it is. Bob has a great way of taking photographs that are accurate and beautiful in their own way, and yet ominous and scary as well. And that's all they're all wrapped up in that one picture there. The reason they have to have that pool of water there is because these wastes are so radioactive. They're millions of times more radioactive than uranium. You have here a uranium plant. These wastes are millions of times more radioactive than uranium. And the reason why is because the uranium atoms have been split. And when the uranium atoms are split, you create a whole multitude, hundreds of broken fragments, which are new atoms, smaller atoms, which are very unstable and consequently very radioactive. And the radioactivity alone generates heat. And if you don't have water cooling the fuel, it's going to overheat spontaneously. And possibly when it's fresh fuel out of the reactor, freshly out of the reactor, it can even melt under its own heat. In fact, that's what causes meltdowns. Many people don't know that the Fukushima reactors that melted down in Japan, 3 of them, they didn't melt down because of the reactors operating. The reactors were shut down within minutes after the earthquake. But a day and so later, the fuel melted down because of its own generated heat from the radioactivity. It's the radioactivity itself that caused the meltdown. And that's what we're dealing with here. Those radioactive wastes cannot be moved for 30 years after they come out of the reactor. Consequently, they're going to be accumulating here in Northumberland County, right on the shore of Lake Ontario. And there's going to be 30 years worth for every reactor that is operating. This is what happens when you take it out of the pool. You have to put it into what's called a dry storage container. These dry storage containers, this particular one contains something like 384, I can't see the number there, 384 or something like that, fuel bundles. But the fuel bundles themselves inside weigh 10 tons, whereas the cask that contains them weighs 60 tons. So imagine, just think to yourself, think about a refrigerator, and imagine a case to ship the refrigerator where the case is 6 times heavier than the refrigerator. That's what we have here. That's what these dry storage casks are like. And that's because they realize that these wastes are so incredibly dangerous that they have to protect workers and the public from exposure, inadvertent exposure to the wastes. What a nuclear accident is, when they do have a nuclear accident such as a meltdown, what it is an accident that allows this stuff that is already there to be released. It's sitting there waiting to be released. If it were attacked from a military operation, bomb, for example, or if there was a severe earthquake, or as at Fukushima, where you had tsunami followed by a complete loss of power to the plant, that's when these things go wrong, and that's when everything can be spewing out of the reactor and causing widespread contamination for a very long time. So that's what we call a nuclear accident. And of course, they do everything in their power to prevent such an accident from happening. But the question is, how much is really in their power? We find out oftentimes that what they thought was in their power was not in their power at all. So nuclear waste has nowhere to go. Most of it will stay at Wesleyville for more than 100 years if this plant goes ahead. And the reason for that is because they're hoping that these reactors would last for maybe 60 years before they were shut down. Now, that's never happened before. Reactors don't last that long, but that's dreaming in Technicolor, right? But if they last for 60 years and then you still can't move the spent fuel until it's cooled off for another 30 years, you're already almost 100 years. So this stuff is going to be hanging around and accumulating and building up on the shores of Lake Ontario, right outside the town of Port Hope. And I believe we all have to take responsibility for that vision and ask ourselves, is that something we want to see occur just by doing nothing, just by being complacent, just by sitting back and making the decisions be made by the experts? Or is it something we figure is worth standing up for and opposing before it happens so that it doesn't happen? I also want to point out there, the little image at the bottom there, the little red dots indicate each dot represents 3 years of spent fuel, spent radioactive fuel, and the first 30 years cannot be buried. It cannot be even moved. It's only the older stuff that can be buried. So the fact is that the on-site hazard is not really diminished by very much by burying the old stuff, because the new stuff is continually being produced and accumulating in the area of the plant. So that here we have, for example, how many reactors might we have? Well, for 10,000 megawatts, we have there 8 reactors. 8 reactors at 1,200 megawatts each would give you your 10,000 megawatts. All of that, all of those red dots are the unburied ones. They're going to be sitting there, right on the lakeshore. Good idea? You tell me. So nuclear waste is an unsolved problem, and many people, both in and out the industry, know this in their heart, but they say, well, what is the alternative? Well, one of the alternatives is to stop producing it, but that's not an alternative they like. And so therefore they say, look, let us find a hole in the ground where we can put this stuff, and then that gives us a freedom and a license to go ahead and keep on producing the waste indefinitely into the future. I say that's nonsense. The only way you can possibly, and I'm not sure it is possible, the only way you can possibly get this safely out of off the Earth's surface is to shut the reactors down and move it all. Because if you keep on producing more waste at the top, you're never going to have a problem that is solved. It simply has the appearance of being solved, the illusion of being solved. It's the illusion of a solution. Just as we say dilution is not the solution to pollution, I could also say illusion is not the solution to pollution either. Now, so big nuclear plans at Wesleyville, the question is, what on earth happened to the small modular reactors? Weren't they telling us for years now that small modular reactors are the way to go because the big reactors are obsolete? We're not going to build those things anymore. We're going to build the small ones. That's the smart way to do it. How come? How come they're talking about such big reactors when, in fact, they are promoting small modular reactors? So let's take a look at the picture. Small modular nuclear reactors are usually abbreviated SMR. Do you notice anything funny about that? There's a letter missing, N. They leave out the N. They call it a small modular reactor, not a small modular nuclear reactor. They leave out the N. That's the place where all the problems are, the N. Leaving out the N is not a mistake. It's part of their PR. It's part of their spin. Also, SMR could mean spending money recklessly, which I think is a more accurate sort of description of what these things might truly be. Because if we go back to, if we take a trip back to the future, back to the year 2018, when Canada first produced its small modular reactor nuclear roadmap, well, it was motivated by the sad state of the nuclear industry at that time, which had been stagnant for 25 years. Here's a graph from 2018, around that time, from the World Nuclear Association, and you'll notice that it shows the growth worldwide of nuclear reactors. And for the first couple of decades, you had exponential growth. They're just being grown faster and faster and faster. And then you notice it just totally flattened out. Now, one of the reasons it totally flattened out was because for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, the nuclear industry did not even tell people about nuclear waste. They never said a word about it. And now, by the way, when they talk about small modular reactors, have you noticed? They never even mention nuclear waste. They took the N out, and therefore it's gone. It's no longer a problem. So there's a great deal of self-deception going on here and a great deal of selling on the general public and the decision makers to spend a lot of public money on something that is really a dead-end technology. As a matter of fact, back in that same period of time, in 2019, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, in the November 2019 issue, wrote an editorial in which they said, the International Atomic Energy Agency, looking ahead to 2050, sees the most optimistic scenario for nuclear as only about 5%, down from about 10% today. Now, let me explain what that means. When I showed you this graph before, I didn't mention to you that back when it hit the peak there were 433 reactors representing 17% of global electricity. That's a big chunk, 17% of global electricity. But by the end of that period in 2019, they had almost the same number of reactors, only 4 more reactors, by the way, and it only represented 10% of global electricity. So actually the share of electricity from nuclear power to the world market has been declining very steeply for the last 25 years, and it's still going down. It's now down to 9%, and it's continuing to go down, and nobody, even in the nuclear industry, expects it's going to come up anytime soon. It's going to keep going down for at least the next 10 years before it even has a chance of coming up. As a matter of fact, they're going to be shutting down old reactors faster than they can possibly build new ones, because the old reactors are very old, and they need to be shut down. So back around 2001, the nuclear industry already realized that they were in big trouble because they were losing market share. They were on a big decline. And so they had to do something. They had to rejuvenate the industry. And they decided to declare that there's going to be a nuclear renaissance. And the nuclear renaissance means we're going to build hundreds or maybe even thousands of large nuclear reactors all over the world. This was just simply the old idea of building large reactors on steroids, right? And it turned out to be just a litany of failures because nothing worked for them. They only got a handful of orders, really a handful of orders, and they did not turn out well. Here, for example, there was a French giant called Areva, which was a salesman of nuclear reactors, and they went bankrupt. They collapsed. But they can't actually go bankrupt because they're owned by the government of France. And so they were absorbed by another government agency called Électricité de France. But the Électricité de France did not take the 5 billion euros in debt, which they carried with them, because that $5 billion in debt was more than their total assets. Anyway, they planned a reactor in Finland called the Olkiluoto 3 reactor. It was a big one, 1,400 megawatts, and it began in 2005, long time ago, 2005. They're supposed to be operational in 3 years. That was the promise, at a cost of 3 billion euros. And everybody said, oh, good, now we're past the bad days. We're now going to build plants cheaply and on time and quickly. Well, it turned out that it started up in March 2022, 19 years later, at a cost of more than 11 billion euros. So that means it took 6 times longer to build than planned, and cost 4 times more. So now that plant is running and it is producing electricity in Finland now, but it bankrupted Areva, and it just showed you that these promises are not worth the paper they're printed on. It was one of the stars of the nuclear industry, but it really ruined a nuclear giant. Another example is the bankruptcy of Westinghouse in 2017. Westinghouse went bankrupt because they, as a result of getting orders for 4 large nuclear reactors, which were called EP1000 reactors. They're about 1,000 megawatts each. AP1000 reactors. By the way, AP1000 is going to be one of the contenders for the Wesleyville plants. When they get permission to go ahead with Wesleyville, they hope they will, they're not specifying what they're going to build. They might build CANDU reactors, or they might build something else, and it could very well be AP1000 reactors. So these are the reactors which you might be building here at Wesleyville. Now, it turns out that South Carolina ordered 2 of these reactors, and they, after spending $9 billion in the construction, they simply blew the whistle and said, we're not going to spend any more money on this. It's going nowhere. It's not going to work. And so it bankrupted Westinghouse, and it was a $9 billion loss. And Westinghouse went bankrupt in 2017. The other 2, however, continued in Georgia. They're called the Vogtle reactors, 3 and 4, and they were built, and they're now operating. But the Vogtle reactor, the construction license was given in 2012. Again, look at the time and the cost. The estimated cost was $14 billion. The actual cost was $35 to $36 billion. That's what the actual cost came in at. Amazing, eh? The estimated completion date was 2016 to 2017. The actual completion date was 2023, 2024, just a couple of years ago. They're now running. The units 3 and 4 cost per kilowatt installed, if you just do division, if you divide the megawatts by the cost, you get $15,700 per kilowatt. That's the cost of this electricity. And everybody in the financial world is saying this is the most expensive electricity generating plant ever built anywhere in the entire world. That's what might be coming to Wesleyville. So when people tell you that they know what they're doing and they've got this well in hand, don't believe it. What they do have is they have their back to the wall, because the nuclear industry has been going nowhere for 25 years, and they're desperately looking for more sales, for more activity. They want to get some action. Because the first nuclear renaissance was such a shambles, they've now declared a second nuclear renaissance. And this second nuclear renaissance is packaged as small modular reactors. Around 2018 is when that became current. Another euphemism for SMR is second make-believe renaissance. Because as a matter of fact, despite the fact that they've been working on this and hyping it and talking about it for 8 years, there is not a single small modular reactor built and operating anywhere in the Western world. None. And the reason for that is because people aren't, well, they're either not working out because they're not well thought out, or they're unaffordable, or people just don't give it the go-ahead that it needs. The problems for small modular nuclear reactors is they're very costly. When you put things down in scale, you lose what's called the economies of scale. The economies of building a bigger one is you don't have to use twice as much concrete, twice as much steel in order to build a power plant that's twice as powerful. But when you shrink it down, you go the opposite way. You end up cutting a lot more money for a lot less benefit. And so by nature, it's going to be much more costly to make smaller reactors. That's why they moved to the big ones in the first place. That's wrong. Now, how do they overcome that? Well, the way they overcome that is by mass producing them. They figure if we mass produce them, we can get the cost down. Turn them out like refrigerators, you know, or whatever. But you can't do that when you have 133 different competing models. There's 130 competing models at the present time of nuclear reactors, small modular reactors. They're all different. And how can you mass produce something when you're only doing 1 or 2? Or you need to have orders for hundreds before you can justify setting up a factory to mass produce anything. If you don't have hundreds of orders, it's not worth the cost of building a mass production plant. So the very competition, the very number of competitors makes it unprofitable. Also, the funding is very hard to find because Wall Street will not invest in this stuff, and they advise their clients not to invest in it. So therefore, they turn to public money. And that's where the government of Canada comes in and your wallet comes in, because they're simply picking your pockets. They're simply picking your pockets and the pockets of all Canadians to pay for these boondoggles, which cannot be privately financed. The idea, of course, is that if they put enough public money in it, then the private capital will come along. But in fact, even now, they're saying that private capital will not invest unless they get loan guarantees. That means that the government is on the hook. So if the investment goes sour, they don't lose money. The government has guaranteed the loan. So it's still public money, even though it's via private capital. So this is a real problem. And the other thing that's very difficult is there are few markets and slow deployment, and they're more vulnerable to external threats because they have less robust containment. I've put a few other things here, very simple. They're not so small. They're not so modular. They're not so affordable. They are, however, nuclear. And so those are all downsides. They're not anything they claim to be, and they are what they claim not to be. Here's an example. In Idaho, they wanted to build some small modular reactors, a company called Nuskek. It was a scaled-down pressurized water reactor, only 77 megawatts. Now, that is small, 77 megawatts. And what they wanted to do is build a battery of them. They wanted to build several of them. Rather than building one big plant, they built a bunch of small ones side by side. And, well, it was canceled in 2023. Now, that was after a couple of decades of dithering around with this. So it was canceled in 2023. Why? Because the projected cost of the power doubled, more than doubled, 2.5 times. And so the investors who were from Utah backed out and said, we're not there anymore. So this project was canceled. It joined the scrap heap of other projects. Chalk River, Ontario, they wanted to build an even smaller reactor, only 5 megawatts. Now, 5 megawatts is really, really small. 5-megawatt reactor called the Ultra-Safe Micro-Modular Reactor. Doesn't that sound like a great name? And it was going to be a gas-cooled reactor that was going to have molten salt heat storage. It was not going to generate 5 megawatts of electricity, but only 5 megawatts of heat. Now, 5 megawatts of heat would only produce about 1 or 2 megawatts of electricity maximum, so it's really small. Well, Ultra-Safe Corporation went bankrupt. They filed for bankruptcy in 2024, and so the project is not canceled but paused. They might pick it up again if somebody brings Ultra-Safe Corporation out of bankruptcy or buys the assets otherwise. Here's another thing that we've all heard about, and that's just next door in Darlington. The BWRX-300, it's a boiling water reactor, 300 megawatts. That's about half the size of the LaPro reactor in New Brunswick, or a third the size of an existing CANDU at Darlington. It's estimated to cost $6.5 billion Canadian, equal to the cost per megawatt of the Votel plants in Georgia that I just told you about a little while ago. It's under construction. The Canadian regulator has given a construction license for the first of 4 units to be built east of Toronto at Darlington. Now, a closer look reveals that the BWRX-300 is 21 stories high. So when people tell you these are small modular reactors, don't believe it. 21 stories high. That's 10 stories above ground and 11 stories below ground, because a lot of it is underground. So it's not so small and not so modular either. A workforce of up to 4,000 people has been cited by the Prime Minister, who has invested federal money in this project to the tune of about $2 billion. Our money, our tax money. Here's an overhead picture provided to me by Ralph just yesterday of the construction site that's going on right now. Now take a look at that picture. Those little pieces of rice on the side of the road, those are cars and trucks. Those are cars and trucks. This is the site of a construction of a small modular reactor. Do you see that big hole in the ground and you see that crane? That is the largest crane in the entire world. And it was used to lift the concrete platform to put it down at the bottom of that hole as the foundation of this Darlington BWRX-300 reactor. So it's an incredible thing when you look at the scene and you ask yourself, this represents only 3% of what is proposed for Wesleyville. Look at that construction site and think of that as 3% of what you're in store for. And now, what's even more alarming is that the cost per kilowatt, if you work it out, works out by just dividing the numbers, right? Dividing by 300, 6.5 billion divided by 300, it comes out to 21,666 Canadian dollars per kilowatt, which translates to about 15,500 US dollars. Well, you know what? That's very close to the Votel cost, which is 15,700. So this has to be counted, the Darlington plant, BWRX-300, as among the most expensive electricity plants ever built in the world. By the way, one of the things that particularly upsets me, which I intervened 3 times on this particular dossier before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And the way they simplified the size of it somewhat, it is smaller than what they had in 2011. And the way they simplified the size was by eliminating several safety systems, including the emergency core cooling system, the emergency pressure relief valves in the primary coolant system, and several other safety systems were simply eliminated in order to keep the cost from going absolutely through the stratosphere. So now here's the situation, ladies and gentlemen, is that although there's all this talk about small modular reactors, that's not what they're building at all. If you look at the new nuclear plans in Canada, they are talking about 4 large nuclear reactors in the Peace River area of northern Alberta, 4,800 megawatts. At Bruce C, they want to build 4 more reactors at Bruce, you've heard. Those are large ones too. Another 4,800 megawatts. Here at Wesleyville, they want to build large reactors, 10,000 megawatts. That adds up to 19,600 megawatts. That's almost 20,000 megawatts of large reactors. What about the small reactors? Well, at Darlington, we're proposing 4 300-megawatt reactors. That's 1,200 megawatts. One at Point Lepreau called the ARC 100. That's another 100 megawatts. That comes to 1,300 megawatts. Obviously, Canada is not building small modular reactors right now. They're building they want to build large nuclear reactors. And the reason why is because the light is beginning to dawn that the small reactors are prohibitively expensive. And in fact, the large ones are prohibitively expensive as well. So one begins to wonder that maybe all this talk about small modular reactors was just to get people used to the idea of nuclear good so that they could then build large ones again. So they're going back and wanting to build the old-fashioned ones that small ones are supposed to supplant. Now, let's take a look at the competition. What is the nuclear industry so scared of? What they're scared of is the fact that other sources of electricity, clean electricity, are beating the pants off them. That's what they're scared of. Because, as a matter of fact, this is from Wall Street. This is from the Lazard firm, which publishes annual reports on the levelized cost of various energy sources. And what they point out there, if you look at the red bars, which I added the red, that's not in the original, you notice that wind with storage and solar with storage are both much cheaper than nuclear, which is down at the bottom there. Now, as a matter of fact, the highest possible cost of wind and solar, both of them, are far less expensive than the lowest possible cost of nuclear. So why would anybody be buying the most expensive thing on the shelf? Especially when it's the slowest thing on the shelf. Because nuclear takes a lot longer to deploy than either wind or solar. So if you're really talking about a crisis or an emergency, like we got to do something about climate change, shouldn't you invest in the cheapest, fastest things first and not in the slowest, most expensive things? That's what we are being told is common sense. And that is not common sense, ladies and gentlemen. Now, even if we go back to that same period of time I was just talking about, 2018, 2019, even then the U.S. Energy Information Administration was projecting the future to look very rosy for renewables. You see that sharp green line on the left there? That sharp green line that slopes upwards, that's renewable energy. And the bottom line is the red line, that's nuclear. The thing is, renewables have been beating the pants off nuclear around the world. Last year alone, 92.5% of all new electricity production in the world was renewable. And yet we're wanting to build nuclear. At COP28, which is the climate change crisis, back then in 2023, there was a commitment by over 200 of member nations, the official commitment, to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency by 2030, which is just around the corner, as you know, only 4 years from now. But this was considered feasible because of the rapid growth that's already been taking place. It's not beyond question that that can be done. It will take work, it'll take effort, it'll take investment, but it can be done. We can triple renewables and we can double energy efficiency. Meanwhile, a smaller group of 25 nations without any consents from the COP28 conference projected privately that they would like to triple nuclear energy by 2050. Notice that's 20 years later. So we're going to achieve similar benefits by 2050 the renewables are going to achieve by 2030. Again, just dramatizes the situation. Now here's a graph that is very hard to read. It's a kind of a little skippy blue line there, but what it's about is the remarkable increase in capacity of battery storages. These large utility companies, like in Texas, they have Epcot, and Epcot has invested a lot in solar energy. Many people don't know that it's biggest investor in North America in solar energy in Texas. And because solar is intermittent, because the sun is not always shining, you need to have battery storage. They have battery storage now. In December of 2025, they drew out of the batteries 10,000 megawatts of electricity. The same amount that is supposed to be built here at Wesleyville, not from nuclear reactors, from batteries. So people do not realize that the technology of batteries, like the technology of renewable energy, has been increasing dramatically, and the cost continues to go down for both renewable energy and even faster for battery storage. So that's the writing on the wall, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of what the future holds. It's obvious to everybody, of course, that if we were able to meet all of our needs with renewable energy, we wouldn't have to worry about things like the Strait of Hormuz, because we wouldn't need the oil that those tankers are carrying. We would be running our societies on renewable energy, and it would be a much more peaceful world, because these non-renewable resources are the source of great international tension and great international conflict. Look at the bombing of Iran, unprovoked, by the United States and by Israel, over what? Over something that they don't seem to really have any control over. So it's an indication of some of the advantages of renewables, and a renewable path are economic. Some of them are environmental, but some of them are simply social and political. They're politically and socially much more benign technologies than the ones that we're promoting. Now, people say, of course, well, yeah, but if you don't build nuclear, aren't you just going to worsen the greenhouse gas problem? Well, Germany got rid of all of its 17 nuclear reactors. They shut them all down on schedule by 2022. They said they'd shut the last one down on 2022. They actually went 1 year over. They went to 2023. But they got all 17 reactors shut down. And this is in Germany. The greenhouse gas emissions have been steadily dropping year after year and continue to drop. There's only one little glitch at the very bottom where it goes up a little bit. The reason it went up for a little bit was because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. During that time, Germany was called upon to help its neighbors with electricity, and so they exported electricity, believe it or not, to France. France, which has all the nuclear reactors anybody could possibly want, didn't have enough electricity to meet their own needs because half of their reactors were shut down for various reasons. And they actually had to import electricity from Germany, who had shut down all their nuclear reactors altogether. This is a little cover of a study published by the Ontario Clean Energy Alliance, based in Toronto. You know Angela Bischoff, and they're a great organization, and it's called Port Hope's Electricity Future, Wind and Solar or New Nuclear. Don't believe the lie that there's no alternative. There's lots of alternatives. None of those alternatives are without difficulties. None of those alternatives are without risks, but some of them are a lot better than others. The cost per kilowatt hour estimated by the Ontario Clean Air Alliance is obviously much better. Even offshore wind is estimated by them to be a lot more expensive than onshore wind, but still less expensive than nuclear. So, and of course, if you go offshore, you have a much greater capacity to use less land area, but it's more expensive for sure. However, I saw a study in Michigan, just using Lake Michigan alone, you could install enough feasible wind power in Lake Michigan that would account for 1/4 of the entire electrical capacity of the United States of America, which sounds phenomenal and probably is probably unrealistic. But it just shows you that there's a vast untapped potential that people are not even aware of. Now, I want to turn now to radioactivity, because the radioactivity is one of the jokers in the deck that we haven't talked about. That's one of the things that makes nuclear power so difficult to compete with renewables, because they have to have safety systems that will allow them to control the dangers of radioactivity. Solar and wind don't have to do that because they have no such dangers. Basically, what is a nuclear power plant? It's simply a boiler. That's all it is. It's a way of boiling water to generate steam. It's a steam engine. And you use the steam to turn a turbine and generate electricity. It's very inefficient. 2/3 of the heat produced is wasted and is dumped into the environment. Only 1/3 is converted into electricity. And that's true with a nuclear plant or with any other type of oil-fired plant or coal-fired plant. It's the same thing. The only difference is how you get the steam. Now, in a nuclear plant, you get the steam by splitting uranium atoms. The problem with splitting uranium atoms is you create hundreds of new radioactive materials which were never found in nature before 1940. They're brand new entries into the evolutionary race on Earth. And our bodies and the animals around us, all of our relations as indigenous people like to say, we have no evolutionary ability to cope with these materials because our body has not had the need to do that before. So consequently, they're extremely dangerous. When they get into the body, they cause damage to living cells. And that damage can lead, in some cases, to cancers, in other cases, to genetic damage. In some cases, in pretty well all cases, it leads to a suppression of the immune system and many other various illnesses, including strokes and heart attacks. So the idea of the nuclear industry is simply to keep these things isolated from the environment by putting them in a place where nature can't get at it. And that's the whole idea behind deep geological repositories. Many people think that it is far from proven to be safe, because we've already had experiences with 3 geological repositories which have leaked radioactive materials out of them, 2 in Germany, 1 in Carlsbad, New Mexico. So, and again, contrary to assurances you're given by OPG, these plants do routinely give off into the air and into the water large amounts of radioactive materials, which are radioactive hydrogen, radioactive carbon, carbon-14, and radioactive iodine, smaller amounts of radioactive iodine routinely given off into the air and the water, and a smattering of dozens of other radioactive materials which come out as what are called particulates. I have done a calculation, and actually I showed you this calculation, it was on my slides as well, I could have showed you again. But last time I was here, I showed you a calculation that shows that the amount of tritium given off every year by the Wesleyville plant would be enough to contaminate the same amount of water. If you were to put all that tritium into the water and contaminate it to the maximum permissible amount that is allowed by law, that amount of water that would be contaminated every year would be the same as the water that's consumed by the city of Toronto every year. So it's a large, don't let anybody tell you this is a small amount of radioactivity. What's more, that's based on the existing Canadian standard for tritium in water. It's called tritium, radioactive hydrogen. That's based on the current standard of 7,000 becquerels per liter. A becquerel is 1 atomic disintegration per second. If you had 7,000 becquerels in a liter of water and you drank that liter of water, then you'd have 7,000 disintegrations per second inside your body going on. That's called an internal emitter. And there's no way that you can filter radioactive water from non-radioactive water. They behave exactly the same way. So there's no municipal drinking water purification system that can remove the tritium from the drinking water. And also, nor from the irrigation water that farmers might be using for their crops and so on. So I just want to leave on that note, just to simply tell you, that, and you can consult me and my website, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility has a simple address, it's ccnr@web.ca, and we can give more information on all these subjects. But I'll now wind up and we'll open the floor for questions. That's about half the size of the LaPro reactor in New Brunswick, or a third the size of an existing CANDU at Darlington.